Hey everyone, it is Friday, January 3rd, 2020, and I'm Falcon filling in for Jake Baldino. As per usual, we're here to talk about what's going on in the gaming world. This week we're doing something a little bit different that's not just the voice that's coming at you. We're actually going to go back and look at some of the biggest surprises of the last decade. The first thing let's talk about is how way back in 2010, you would have thought that game streaming would have been a thing by 2020. A streaming service known as OnLive was launched. It wasn't bad or anything. It was actually pretty good considering it was a decade ago, but it also didn't pan out. A few years later, in January 2014, PlayStation Now launched, which also didn't really take off. Again, wasn't actually a terrible service, but as of now, PlayStation Now has turned into a service very much like Xbox Game Pass, which might have been kind of a response to the streaming thing, but I don't really know, to be honest. Xbox Game Pass is actually a pretty sweet service too, and PlayStation Now moving into that area is probably a good idea. But I mean, we all kind of thought like the Netflix for games would have happened by 2020, and it didn't. Google didn't even pull it off with their big launch of Stadia last year. If anybody was going to get it, it was probably going to be that project, and we're not there yet. Moving on, another huge surprise that happened in 2010 was Bungie signing an agreement with Activision so they would publish their games for a full decade. Perhaps more surprising, though, was that it didn't get fulfilled. Bungie actually broke up with Activision, legally speaking, and somehow secured their rights to Destiny's publishing as painlessly as is imaginable. Usually when you hear about this type of thing happening, it's not a clean breakup, and this pretty much was. Something I think nobody expected was the Minecraft and Fortnite phenomenons, or their staying power. See, Minecraft technically hit in May of 2009, but the vast majority of its momentum was built in 2010 and 11, when it gradually turned itself into an unstoppable behemoth, one that Microsoft purchased in 2014 for $2.5 billion. Perhaps what's even more surprising is that that behemoth is going very strong at this very moment, and probably will continue to do so for quite a while. Something I probably never would have predicted would be the entirety of the Soulsborne genre. See, back in 2009, Demon's Souls came out. It was a PlayStation exclusive, was only out on PlayStation 3, and was itself a spiritual successor to King's Field, another series by From Software. Demon's Souls was a cult hit, so when they decided to make Dark Souls as a multi-platform title, I don't know that they were expecting it to be as big of a hit as it was. Dark Souls, which came out in 2011, set a bunch of norms that have been followed by a lot of developers, establishing its own subgenre within action RPG canon. Without Dark Souls, we'd never have the Surge games, Ashen, Nioh, and probably countless other amazing games. I mean, yeah, there are some duds that just kind of take the formula and do nothing with it, but even From Software has grown immensely making these games, with Sekiro Shadows Die Twice being such a great game. Another big surprise I remember was that the unfinished survival game became a genre. You know the type of game I'm talking about, the type that releases to early access, stays in early access, and never leaves early access. It's an early access game for its entire life cycle. It's a survival game, and therefore you know exactly what it entails. And yeah, some of them eventually did get finished. Here's a big surprise that happened over the last decade. I know a lot of us were very skeptical about phone games for a very long time. In fact, I think it's still plenty alright to be skeptical as to exactly how good they can be, but exactly how much money they can make, the jury is no longer out on that. In 2018, it was shown that mobile games actually overtook the PC market and the console market combined. Mobile games overtook 51% of the full gaming market, being a $70 billion market themselves. I mean, it may not be as surprising when you think about how they make their money, but still. The birth of the loot box problem, over monetization, and even the idea of games as a service. Now, of course, we've had MMOs for a very long time. We understand the idea of games as a service as something that definitely predates 2010. However, holy lordo, did that ever become the norm this decade, at least for a while? We're seeing single-player games kind of making a bit of a resurgence at the moment, thankfully so. But all these ways of not really finishing a game, kind of just making an experience and letting people continue to do it in order to fleece money off of them, certainly became very big in this decade. Now let's get into what I would consider one of the biggest ones of the entire decade: Hideo Kojima leaving Konami. At the time, it really wasn't shocking. The relationship between him and Konami was visibly strained. However, if you had told any Kojima fan prior to that year that this is what would have happened, I don't know that people would have believed you. Kojima had been with Konami since the 1980s. The entirety of his creative career up until that point was with Konami. And a lot of people still don't understand Death Stranding, but that's okay, because it's great. And Kojima is great, and he kind of showed that Konami was the bad guy in that situation. All I have to say to explain that is Metal Gear Survive. Which, yeah, could have been worse than it was. If we want to talk about surprises, it's that game wasn't utter trash, but it was built on a good foundation that was made by people who really knew what they were doing. And even when we were surprised at how not horrible it was still kind of bad. I mean, I was kind of shocked when Doom came back. I knew that Doom would probably have another game at some point, but I didn't think that they would just heavily reboot it and make it into what we got, which frankly is pretty good. Does it recapture the exact magic of being the first technically advanced first-person shooter? Not really, but did it have to? I think a lot of us were also taken aback by how big of a success Witcher 3 was as well. I mean, different company, but you get the point. CD Projekt Red went from kind of decently sized indie studio to a gargantuan studio. I mean, Witcher 3 was so successful that Netflix Witcher series probably wouldn't exist if that game didn't exist. And while we're on stuff like that, let's talk about esports. Esports is an entire industry unto itself in 2020, but even a few years ago, it was basically StarCraft. StarCraft was huge, don't get me wrong, and it went for a long time, but now we have games being developed specifically for esports. Lots of them. And this really didn't happen until the last 6-7 years. It's very cool because it does in a lot of ways ensure that gaming will always be something. We've created sort of a built-in competitive element that we all rely on either to go into or for entertainment, and that's cool. But I have to say, I didn't see it coming. If you asked me in 2011, I'd have been like, that's not going to happen. It's always going to be like StarCraft and a couple other games. One of my favorite things that happened that people kind of didn't expect, but if you can recall, I did, was the Nintendo Switch being a huge success. You see, with the Wii U, a lot of ideas the Switch would bring into fruition were sort of on display in what we might call kind of a proto-Switch. But people really didn't understand what the Wii U was. And it was in part because Nintendo was super confusing about it. There was a lot of naysaying about the Nintendo Switch, but on November 16th, 2016, I, Falcon, told you it was going to do well. And many of you laughed. Many of you noticed that I had a cold in the video, as I do in this video and with the last few videos, as some of you have noticed as well. That's okay. Didn't make me any less right about the Nintendo Switch. One really cool development that happened probably in the last maybe 2 years is VR going mainstream. It's not as ubiquitous as any other form of gaming. There isn't like a VR market that takes up a meaningful amount of the gaming market or anything like that. But the words Half-Life Alyx come to mind. That's a serious looking game. In its own way, it's kind of annoying they announced that instead of Half-Life 3, but still, whatever. Sony didn't give up on VR. In fact, the PSVR is a pretty great thing. Is this going to be something that sticks around for years to come? Maybe, actually. And that's not a bad thing. I've never really been against VR. I've just never thought it would catch on. It kind of has, and that's cool. And finally, probably the biggest gaming surprise that has ever happened in my entire life happened this decade, and that's cross-play between all the consoles. I would have never thought in a million years that would exist. When I played Super Nintendo, I never thought, wow, they're going to let me play this game against somebody on a Genesis. Nope, just never would have. And now it's normal. I mean, kids get on Fortnite. It's not even a thing they think about. It's actually a really cool development that I'm really happy is the norm now. And hopefully it stays that way forever. And that's it for me this week. I hope that was an alright Friday show. I mean, it wasn't a typical one. That time between Christmas and New Year's is never usually a big time for gaming news or anything, and we kind of thought looking back on stuff would be at least fun. You know, share some of your favorite memories, things you were surprised about in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. So click subscribe and don't forget to enable all notifications. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter, Falcon the Hero, and we'll see you next time right here on Gameranx.